Hi,
Hi, Laurie.
how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, thank God. Who's with us?
And what?
Who's in class?
We have Debbie there. Sue Ellen's coming. Belinda should be here. I expect a few people that don't usually come Sundays.
Oh, Marty should be coming too.
And Marty, too. Welcome. We're on recording now. And so it's past 8. So we will begin. Let us begin by sharing the screen. Hold on. I can't even see it. Well, my problem is I don't see anything on this screen. So hold on a second. We're going to try this again. Okay. Excuse the delay. Technical difficulties. We're going to try this one more time. Let's see. Let's try this one. Okay. Here we go. Ready to blast off. Welcome. Today, we are going to finish up the introduction to Hit Bodhidut, the isolation meditation, with a survey of sources in Jewish thinking and literature that Rabbi Kaplan conducted about all these references to Hit Bodhidut as being an essential basic meditation. I have to tell you, he did some very thorough work. We'll also discuss how to deal with the meditation problem of discouragement, which you probably have found that to be a problem yourself, and it's a universal problem. And we're going to end Bante, our expert on meditation, at least one of them, is going to give us some tips. Just as a reminder, there's no class this Sunday. It's the end of Yontif. So our next class is next Wednesday, the 7th of April. And then the following Sunday is also our class. We're we're resuming our Sunday schedule then. So no Sunday, yes Wednesday, and then yes Sunday. We have works in progress answering these questions about Konei HaKol. What does it mean when God's purchasing or owning? What about astrology or mazalot? And can the Mashiach be a woman? I am compiling sources, and there's a few other questions along the way that I'm going to be addressing as I accumulate resources. So without further ado, let us begin. To start with, I'm going to review what Rabbi Kaplan said about this Hit Bodhidut, about the internal isolation. And then we'll get into the review of his sources. This is what he says. Many people are initially surprised to discover that meditation plays any role whatsoever in biblical teachings. It is a subject not often discussed in this context, and many individuals who are otherwise knowledgeable of biblical thought are hardly aware that numerous important classical Judaic commentators interpret certain passages as referring to meditative experiences. One important reason for this is that such practices have not been in use since the great Hasidic Renaissance almost 2 centuries ago. This is really interesting, and he refers to this a lot. A couple of 100 years ago, their meditation ceased being even a fringe activity, and it became out, it was dropped out of the Jewish frame of reference for understanding text. So if they don't know what meditation is, they don't know to look for it in their interpretation of text. It's like believing is seeing. If you don't believe, you won't see it. So he, however, as a believer in meditation, reinterpreted text and said, yeah, this is what we're talking about. Where the experience itself is not known, the meaning of words used to describe it also become forgotten, and the entire vocabulary is lost. Therefore, before the concept of meditation as it occurs in Hebraic sources can adequately be discussed, a basic vocabulary must be developed. What are the words that are used in the Bible and in the commentaries on the Bible and in the mystical lore that mean meditation? And bear in mind that there's various forms of meditation. There are a few words in the Bible itself that apparently have important connotations with regard to meditative states of unconsciousness, but these expressions are not used in this context in post-biblical literature. So in commentaries and studies and teachings post-Tanakh, there was a lack of an understanding of meditation, and therefore those teachings were not understood to refer to meditation. There is, however, one word that is consistently used as a term for meditation by commentators, philosophers, and Kabbalists altogether. The one word which most often denotes meditation is hitbodedut. The verb to meditate is represented by the words hitboded. The word hitboded is derived from the root beit daled daled, meaning to be alone. Literally then, hitbodedut actually means self-isolation, and in some cases it actually means nothing more than physical seclusion and isolation. In many other places, however, it is used to denote a state of consciousness involving the isolation of the self, that is, the isolation of the individual's most basic essence. If I'm not mistaken, one of my favorite metaphysical writers, Ethan Dorshav, who talks about the metaphysical philosophy that is apparent in Tanakh, he would call this the neshama, I think. Thus, when discussed in a Kabbalistic context, the word hitbodedut means much more than mere physical isolation. It refers to a kind of internal isolation where the individual mentally isolates his essence from his thoughts. One of the greatest of all Kabbalists, Reb Chaim Vital, often speaks, he was from the 1500s, often speaks of such mental seclusion, saying that one must seclude himself hitboded in his thoughts to the ultimate degree. In doing so, one separates his thoughts to the one separates his soul from the body to such a degree that he no longer feels any relationship to his physical self. The soul is thus isolated, and as Rabbi Chaim Vital concludes, the more one separates himself from the physical, the greater will be his perception. Obviously advanced, obviously lofty. I'm not encouraging anybody in this class to go for some kind of out-of-body experience when we meditate. This is beyond my ability to relate to or to instruct about. But as I've said, this is not a class on guiding you in your meditation. We're introducing it to you. This state of mental seclusion is very important to the prophetic experience. There is considerable discussion of this, but the clearest description of this state is presented by Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, who's known as Gersonides, or simply the Ralbag. He's from 1288 to 1344. He clearly writes that the receiving of prophetic revelation requires the isolation or hitbodedut of the consciousness from the imagination, or of both of these from the other perceptive mental faculties. The Ralbag, who we're talking about here, is speaking of the meditative state, which he describes as the isolation of the consciousness to an extent where it is no longer disturbed by the imagination. The imagination to which he refers is the normal reverie involving the stream of consciousness and visual imagery that is experienced when all the other senses are shut off. It is from this that the intellect must be isolated, until the individual enters a state of pure consciousness, disturbed by neither reverie nor visual imagery. This is a normal definition of the meditative state, and it is the end result of all successful meditation. In order to attain this, the individual must isolate both the consciousness and the imagination from the other perceptive faculties of the mind. Now, I think that this is what we're doing when we do our meditation and pick a focal point and focus on the focal point. And when the stream of consciousness goes, like what he calls the imaginative faculty, starts whooshing along and trying to pull us along, we separate from it. I think that the position we're assuming when we achieve that separation is this consciousness. And I think it's what would be considered the soul or the neshama, the neshama part of the soul, I think. So we are, in my understanding, doing bodhidut internally when we do that simple meditation for 10 or 15 minutes at the end of this class. Because the question is, when you're meditating and you think, oh, it's Pesach, I can't wait to eat pizza, whatever you're thinking, and you realize, oop, I'm meditating, let me take a step back from that and not get carried away. Where are you going when you're taking a step back? I think you're going to that conscious, internal consciousness that they are talking about right here. The isolation of the consciousness. You're not letting your consciousness get pulled by your reverie, pulled by the imagination that here's describing, and you're taking a step back. So that's what I think is going on. I think if we come across something that disproves that, okay. But I have to tell you that I haven't come across something that does disprove it. So obviously the importance of the physical separation is that you want to put yourself in a space with very limited distraction. If you were to do this in the middle of the Bergen Mall, then there'd be all kinds of distraction, and advanced meditators do it. I mean, Bhante, the expert meditator, talks about, he's waiting for a plane, he's sitting down in the airport meditating. Okay, he's at that level. For those of us that want to learn how to assert maximum self-control over our thoughts, it's better to do it in your own room. Outside is fine as long as you don't have to worry about getting bit by mosquitoes and all this. So both the external and the internal environment should support your attempt at isolation. Excuse me. Okay. So now let's look at sources. This is what Rabbi Kaplan says. We are right here. This is what he says. If these were the only places, and again, the only places are what we've described, Ralbag. We went over last week what Abraham Maimonides says, and Rabbi Abraham is the son of the Rambam, Moses Maimonides. And he, as we learned, thought that Bodhidut was very prevalent in Jewish teachings. And as we learned last week, Rabbi Kaplan somehow uncovered correspondence between the Rambam and his son talking about meditation, leading him to conclude that the Rambam understood meditation and referred to meditation. So Rabbi Kaplan says, all right, all that withstanding, however, one could easily dismiss them as being anomalous. All right, the exception to the rule. However, he says, throughout the length and breadth of Judaic literature, the word is used, and in context, it clearly refers to meditation. The earliest reference that we have found dates from close to 1,000 years ago. And in almost every generation, there is some discussion of the subject. The selections provided here are a literal translation of the words of their authors, presented here for the first time in English. So what he's claiming is that he is the pioneer to uncover references to meditation, in particular, Heat Buddhadut, the pioneer, after 1,000-year layoff of Jewish teachers writing about this in the mainstream. For the most part, these quotations speak for themselves, providing important insight into the role of meditation in Judaic thought in general, without need of additional comment. All right, the first one is from Chai Gaon, religious leader and mystic, from 939 to 1038. This is what he says. God arranged the order of creation so that all things are bound to each other. The direction of events in the lower world depends on entities above them, as our sages teach, quoting, "There is no blade of grass in the world below that does not have an angel over it, striking it and telling it to grow." Close quote. Human souls are also bound to higher levels, and therefore, when a perfect individual becomes involved in meditation, and here the word is Heat Buddhadut, upon wisdom, it is possible for him to predict future events. As a result of his deep meditation, his consciousness and mind fall into a trance, and through his deep probing of the mysteries of existence, he reaches the first cause. The faculties of his heart then become like the Urim and Tumim. Thou are these message-giving elements on the breastplate worn by the Kohen Gadol, which was somehow consulted for prophecy. It's the best way I could describe it. Mystically bound to the angels in heaven, and he becomes attached to the ultimate good. Heat Buddhadut at a very high level. Here is from the Rabbi Ibn Ezra, the Ibn Ezra noted commentator, from 1089 to 1164. On the 6 weekdays, the soul of the enlightened meditates, Heat Boded, on mundane affairs, but on the Sabbath, it must meditate to understand the works of God and his miracles. So if you're enlightened, then you're meditating 7 days a week. It's just a question of what are you meditating on during the week, on mundane affairs, on Shabbat, more holy things. And since he talks about enlightened, I'm going to give you a preview. As of next week, we're going to start understanding, we're going to get an introduction to the Jewish idea of enlightenment in this book. Okay, the next quote is from the Ramban. He lived from 1194 to 1270. He says, in the souls of some individuals, there exists the power of prophecy, through which they can predict the future. No one knows how this comes to them, but they meditate, Heat Boded, and the spirit comes and reveals the future to them. Don't know how that works, but here you can see that Heat Buddhadut is a form of meditation that leads to prophecy. The next source is Rabbi Jacob ben Asher from 1270 to 1343. It is taught that one who prays must concentrate his heart. One must concentrate on the words that leave his lips, depicting the divine presence right in front of him. As it is written, it's from Tehillim, I have placed God before me at all times. He must arouse his concentration, removing all disturbing thoughts so that his mind and concentration in prayer remain pure. This was the way of the saints and men of deed. They would meditate, Heat Boded, concentrating on their prayer until they reached a level where they divested themselves of the physical and were overcome by the spiritual. In this manner, they were able to reach a level close to that of prophecy. Imagine if everybody davened, assuming that God was right in front of them, and therefore they needed to really concentrate on what they were saying. So he's actually talking about having a meditative state when you're praying and being mindful of who you're praying to and who you're praying with. That, of course, would add a lot more meaning to your experience of prayer. The next quote is from Rabbi Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut, 1330 to 1400, a noted philosopher. The Talmud teaches that after he was excommunicated by Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer's wife would not let him fall on his face in prayer, lest he kill Rabban Gamliel. This means that she disturbed him and would not let him meditate hit boded. Through such meditation, a person can attach himself to the proper place and thus bring about wonders and miracles. All right, so putting aside this incident with Rabbi Eliezer's wife, the content of that we're not going to dwell on, but the point is he's making a reference to the Gemara, and he's saying that in the Gemara, there's a reference to hit bodedut. And according to Rabbi Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut, what that's referring to is getting yourself to a proper state of consciousness so that you can actually bring about wonders and miracles. Does that mean you're playing God? Absolutely not, but it implies tapping into powers that you have, more powers than you really think you have. Next quote is from Rabbi Yosef Albo, philosopher, 1380, 1435. And he says, God's thoughts are infinite, and regarding them, King David said, again, Tehillim, if I would count them, they would outnumber the sands. Those are God's thoughts. Pretty much uncountable. Still, in God, all these perfections are seen as an absolute unity, as he adds in Tehillim. For him, meaning God, there is unity in them. So multiple thoughts, but all connected somehow. King David concludes, I awakened and was still with you. Here he is saying, when I was aroused from my meditation, hit bodedut, on these perfections, I found that I am still with you, since they are not something that is separated from you. So he's talking about a situation where the kind of meditation that King David was doing was he was contemplating on God and his thoughts, God metaphorically thinking, and he used internal meditation to be able to get to that state of contemplation. Next one is from the Rabbaz, 1470 to 1572, a legalist and mystic. He says, I have at hand some response that one of the early codifiers received from heaven after asking in a proper manner. He did so through meditation, hit bodedut prayer, and the utterance of divine names, and thus received the reply to his question. So he's referring to legal codifiers who, in their attempt to understand the meaning of halacha, got themselves into a certain state of consciousness through hit bodedut, praying, and uttering divine names, and gained insight that way. Next one is from the Ari, Master Kabbalist, 1534 and 1572. All the discussion regarding fasting and self-mortification found in the earlier texts only apply to one who is not steadily involved in the study of Torah. But when a person's main occupation is the Torah, and when he knows wisdom and fears God, he should not weaken himself and diminish his studies. This then is his rectification. Okay, so if you study Torah, he says, the Ari says, you don't have to go through all this fasting and self-mortification. Rabbi Nachman was notorious for that. He'd do things to his body, and not to say that Rabbi Nachman didn't study, but in this case, the Ari is saying, if you are involved in the study of Torah, you don't have to go to extreme cases, What you do have to do, though, to raise your consciousness is 1 day a week, separate yourself from all people and meditate hit boded upon God. Bind your thoughts to him, just as if you were speaking to him on the day of judgment. Speak to God softly like a slave to his master or a child to his parent. So he's talking about physical hit bodhidut, separating yourself. Doesn't mean you have to go 40 miles into the desert. And you meditate upon God and you try to connect with God. Interestingly, you speak to God as if it was Yom Kippur, so you realize you have to have the feeling that there's a lot at stake in this conversation. And interesting, he says, speak to God softly like a slave to his master or a child to his parent. So this is actually a meditation of hit and bodhidut with a conversation, with sipur, you are talking to God. And what's interesting is you hear a lot of stories about people raising the fist. God, I got to talk to you. I'm mad. What's going on? In this particular case, he's suggesting, the RE is suggesting a different approach, showing humility and gentility in this conversation. I'm not one to say that the shaking your fist at God is inappropriate or unproductive, but this is what the Ari is saying. Next one's from Rabbi Elazar al-Khazri, moralist and mystic from 1522 to 1600. This is what he says. The Talmud teaches that the early saints would wait an hour before praying in order to concentrate their thoughts upon God. Wait an hour before praying to meditate. The commentaries explain that this means that they would empty their minds of all mundane thoughts and would bind their consciousness to the master of all with fear and love. These saints would then pray for an hour and finally wait another hour after their prayers, so that they would spend a total of 3 hours on each of the 3 daily services. 9 hours. It thus came out that they would take off a total of 9 hours each day from their sacred studies in order to engage in meditation. Hit bodhidut. And he's quoting the Talmud again. Binding themselves to God. The light of the divine presence would appear over their heads as if it were spread around them, with them sitting in the midst of the light. And he says, I found this in an old manuscript from the early mystics. You can bet that in this crowd, nobody just plopped in the room, David Mincha Marav with lightning speed, then schlepped and then jumped home. Next comment from Rabbi Emmanuel Francis, poet and philosopher from 1610 to 1710, 100 years. Poets often speak of themselves as if they were referring to other individuals. Jacob thus said, gather around and listen, O sons of Jacob. So the implication there is that's the understanding of that verse in the Torah is that he's talking to himself. I'm not sure that's the context, but in any event, Bilam himself likewise said, thus says Bilam, the son of Beor. And Deborah sang, awake, awake, Deborah. So there she's talking to herself. As far as Jacob, we'll have to look at that. There are many similar cases. This is because of their deep meditation, hit bodhidut, where the mind elevates itself and the body remains as if it were devoid of the soul. It therefore appears to these individuals as if they themselves are another person. That is crazy. Occasionally we find that when they author their songs, poets attain a state of ecstasy where they lose all sensation. This is all because of their deep meditation. So here, he's talking about Jacob, Bilam, Devorah, and other people who, when they refer to themselves in the third person, see themselves as if they're with the other people. And like they see themselves objectively through this kind of separation skill that we're talking about with the meditation. All right, here's one from the Baal Shem Tov, founder of Hasidism, 1698 to 1760. The Baal Shem Tov says, one should constantly meditate, hit boded, on the divine presence. He should have no other thought in his mind other than his love of God, seeking that the divine presence should attach itself to him. In his mind, he should constantly repeat, when will I be worthy that the light of the divine presence should dwell within me? Another one from the Cheetah, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, Sephardic leader and Kabbalist from 1724 to 1860. He says, the root of everything is meditation, Hibodedut. It is a very great and lofty concept, making a person worthy of all holiness. When a person meditates, he is clothed with holiness. When one meditates, he is also attached to God, even with regard to his mundane bodily needs. Now, this is an interesting point to me, because as I've described, in traditional martial arts, you're supposed to be meditating 24/7, or at least be able to achieve that meditative state anytime, especially in combat. So if we understand meditation as a way of cleaving to God, then when he says, when one meditates, he is also attached to God, even with regard to his mundane bodily needs, and you're in combat, you're doing anything physical, then you are also attached to God. Last one is from Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, 1772 to 1810. Rebbe Nachman only lived 38 years. One must include himself in God's unity, which is the imperative existence, capital I, capital E. A person cannot be worthy of this, however, unless he nullifies his ego, and it is impossible to accomplish this without bodedut. When a person meditates and expresses his thoughts before God, he can be worthy of nullifying all desires and all evil traits, so that he becomes worthy of nullifying his entire physical being, thus becoming included in his root. Okay. That's advanced. But you can bet that a step in that direction is what we're doing, which is not letting our stream of consciousness or imagination, as they describe, run away with us, pulling back, so that you're not driven by whatever desires or thoughts or impulses. They're not running rampant, you're controlling them. So that's a step in that direction as far as I understand. And next week, we will start enlightenment. And I know enlightenment is a word that's thrown around all the time in so-called spiritual circles. We're going to find out what Jewish sources have to say. Let's just take a look at the time. Now we go to Bante, best practices in meditation. How do we deal with discouragement? Let us see. Discouragement. This is what Bante says. The upshot of pushing too hard is frustration. We talked last week about pushing too hard. You are in a state of tension. You get nowhere. You realize that you are not making the progress you expected, so you get discouraged. You feel like a failure. It is all a very natural cycle, but a totally avoidable one. Striving after unrealistic expectations is the source. Nevertheless, it is a common enough syndrome, and in spite of all the best advice, you may find it happening to you. There is a solution. And by the way, it is remarkably common. A lot of people quit. It's like, I should be, in Nirvana by next week. I've been doing this 3 times. Where's the beef here? There is a solution. If you find yourself discouraged, just observe your state of mind clearly. You knew he was going to say that. He always says, be mindful of your discouragement. Don't add anything to it. Just watch it. A sense of failure is only another ephemeral emotional reaction. If you get involved, it feeds on your energy and it grows. If you simply stand aside and watch it, it passes away. That is really important. It's like, oh no, I feel like quitting. I really feel like quitting. I've got to quit. It just builds up this whole big thing in your mind, and something this small becomes this big because you keep feeding it. In the martial arts world, we call that, which wolf are you feeding? The wolf that's going to empower you, or the wolf that's going to reduce you? Same kind of thing. If you are discouraged over your perceived failure in meditation, that is especially easy to deal with. You feel you have failed in your practice. You have failed to be mindful. Simply become mindful of that sense of failure. Instead of ignoring it, pushing, resisting, and say, all right, I feel like a failure. What does that look like? You have just reestablished your mindfulness with that single step. That's so clever and so practical. The reason for your sense of failure is nothing but a memory. There is no such thing as failure in meditation. There are setbacks and difficulties, but there is no failure unless you give up. Even if you have spent 20 solid years getting nowhere, you can be mindful at any second you choose. It is your decision. Regretting is only one more way of being unmindful. The instant that you realize that you have been unmindful, that realization itself is an act of mindfulness. So continue the process. Don't get sidetracked by an emotional reaction. This is a man that has his head together. So you can see he's talking about, all right, I'm discouraged. What does that look like? Oh, it's not that bad. All right, you've already established your connection. All right, let's move on. So, and you can see how mindfulness is the key to solving these problems in meditation. You can also see how it's the key to solving problems outside of meditation. All right, so I didn't get this, or I lost that, or this didn't happen. Instead of fighting that, it's like, all right, this didn't happen. I got it. Let's take the next step. Okay, good stuff. We will now stop the share, and we will meditate. So let's bear in mind what we've learned, that what we're doing is something very elemental, but at the beginning of a profound process where you are engaging your soul, and that there should be a complete accepting type of attitude so that you don't fight yourself when things happen when you meditate. Like, all right, I lost track. Let me get back on track. So, and you can imagine, by the way, that if you had that attitude, it helps your relationship with God, because you're saying, all right, God, you didn't give me this. What did you give me? You gave me that. Okay, let's work with that. So the same kind of overcoming the resistance you have with yourself, you can use that skill to overcome your resistance with your relationship with God and say, all right, God, I wanted this, he didn't give me this, but what did you give me? This kind of stuff. So sit straight. There should be a straight line or a good solid structure between your hips and your head. Pretend there's a plate on your head that you want to balance. So, nice straight line. Do an inventory of your body from the top of your head, through your head and shoulders, torso, arms and hands, and hips and legs and feet. And if there's any tension, you mentally relax that point. So your body's like a hose with no kinks in it. Pick a focal point. Could be the breath coming in and out of your nose. and keep your attention on that focal point. And when you lose focus, simply go back to the focal point. You don't fight it, just go back. That is the exercise. Take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. Gradually give into movement. Questions or comments?
Hi, Steve. It's Marty. Yeah, I have a question or a comment. I'm not sure. But if I had signed up, for example, I like to speak in analogy. So if I had signed up for like driver's education course with you, so there might be things like this is what you do at a red light. This is what you do at a four-way stop sign, obeying speed limit signs, merging onto the highway, etc. Then you might have a day when you say, today we're going to learn a little bit about the mechanics, like the brakes and this and that. Because although theoretically you can learn how to be a great driver without knowing how your car works, by knowing a little bit more how it works, you can be even a better driver. And you can get to the point where, you might even start talking about really deep stuff. So, analogously, learning all about meditation and great stuff. And just towards the end of today's lesson, we did a focus on, we touched on like relationship with God. So, or at some point you were saying, not that we want to address right now the idea of arguing with God, but that some of these guys did. And it was done during Hit Bodhidoo. And then, I specifically was hearing an attitude that's similar to the world-class book that you talk about often. World-class people do this, they don't do this. You said, okay, God, you didn't give me that, but you gave me this. Okay, I'll work with this. Well, my reaction is, whoa. It's like, yeah, of course, that's maturity, that's world-class. But, a lot of people have trouble with that. I can go extreme and say that, let's say, even somebody who has a mature attitude and a good relationship with God, and of course, by the way, this applies to all relationships, but might still say something like, okay, God, I understand that, we were exiled for 2,000 years, and, now we have somewhat of our land back. But why did it have to be 2,000 years? It's like, okay, you didn't give me that, you gave me this. It's like, but come on. I mean, how does anybody survive without their land for 2,000? Is that what you wanted to show us? That you can do it, But, there was, I don't want to go through all the horrible things that were listed, culminating in the Holocaust. But it just seems like that's a whole course in and of itself. And hey, Steve, would you like to teach it? Kind of like, working with the deck of cards you were dealt and being mature about it. And, clearly it's something that's always on my mind. So that's all. I guess that's just my comment.
No, thank you. I get it. It's a real good question, especially since this is a meditation course and the emphasis in the meditation seems to be subordinating yourself to the will of God and subordinating your ego and subordinating your impulses and subordinating yourself to a higher power and higher powers, more advanced powers, and ultimately the higher powers. So what room is there for wrestling with God? I'm trying to think if there's a word, there's a name for that type of meditation, or is it simply a way of wrestling with yourself and resolving your own internal conflicts, or is it something that you can actually, is there a way of affecting God's will by doing it? It's a real good question. And I'm going to add it to our list of questions because I think there's sources for that. And I'm actually thinking of a really good one. So I'm going to put that on the list of questions and try to incorporate it into a segment at a later class. I'm going to call it Wrestling with God. I'm thinking right now there's a really good article by either Rabbi Israel Chait or one of his students about the efficacy of prayer. Can you actually move the world, change your fate through prayer? So that's good. I'm glad you brought that up. We're gonna focus on that at some point.
Because I know even when I read in the Hasidic literature, and even some of the common people stories, the common man stories from Hasidus, and you hear something like, everyone wondered, why is the Rebbe quiet during davening? He's usually noisy or something like that. And like, oh, he must know something. And we don't know. And all of a sudden it's time for Baruch Hu, and they're not going to do Baruch Hu until he's ready. He seems to be in a meditative state. Anyway, bottom line is afterwards they say, Rebbe, what happened? We stopped davening for 10 minutes. You seem to be elsewhere. And he says, yeah, I saw that there was an evil decree in heaven. And I knew that we had to do something about it. And so I don't know, I attached my soul to the soul. Whatever the rabbi did, he did. And I overturned the decree.
Wow.
Now, whatever it is, sometimes it's mentioned in the Hasidic, especially Chabad, which wants to emphasize the common man and even the uneducated man, how they can attach to God, sometimes even more than a scholar. Same kind of story, though, because even though it was now some poor blacksmith who knew exactly what to say to God to overturn the decree, it's still an attitude of like, we're going to overturn the decree, which means by definition, the decree must be something we don't want, we don't like. And so here it was the human, this great rabbi who could overturn a decree. Now, if I'm educated with that in school, let's say, year after year after year, which I wasn't because I didn't go to Hasidic style, but if I was, it seems like the teachers better not forget to emphasize that we're not here all to try to learn superpowers to try to overturn decrees. We also have to learn how to get along with the decree. And more so, if let's say we're exiled for 2,000 years, we have to realize it's God's decree, and we have to learn to accept God's decree, and we have to believe that for some reason it's good for us. So you have this continuum from total acceptance to some superpower overturn it. So that's all.
Yeah, there's a lot to that. I don't know how the most elevated spiritual people like the Rebbe was. I don't know the mechanics of their influence.
It often sounds to me like when you describe martial arts. So it's like all of a sudden, rather than be at your place of training, but let's say you're walking down the street and for some reason there's some bad guy who's going to do something. Now, you have to take the situation as it is. You can say, darn it, I wish that guy was shorter. Darn it, I wish there were only one guy, there's two guys. But no, you are where you are. You start from where you start. Always when you talk about the martial arts. So I'm thinking there's got to be something similar to that here. But since it's a class on meditation, and now we just touched on meditation where it can address a relationship with God, and of course that could be a relationship with other people too, then I just wonder, like, okay, so there should be a meditation that is an accepting of where you are, and a meditation of I'm going to try to improve the situation. I guess if you had to bring it down to very basic words, acceptance versus change, it's almost like that. God grant me the serenity to know the difference between what I can change, what I can't change.
Yeah. Well, I would say that any change advocate says you start from where you are right now, though. You can't affect change. Like I really stink at push-ups. You can't, you have to say, I can't do one push-up in order to say, all right, that's my starting point. So same kind of thing. You have to say, I'm a grouch, or I'm an ogre, or I'm ill-tempered, or I get frustrated too easily. That's your starting points in order to grow from there. So I think the two work together. You accept what's in front of you, but it doesn't mean it's always that way. But you're never going to get past it until you have to get through it. You got to go through it. You're never going to get beyond it until you make that your starting point. I think that's for sure.
That's cool.
And the only other thing I have to say about that is there's this great book. This one, Mindful Loving. So what is this guy? This guy, Henry Grayson, I think he was a priest. And then he became some kind of couples counselor. And he said, so he's talking about, in loose words, he's talking about the vibes we send out and how people that are like married or they're having an intimate relationship, they're connected. And he talks about this one couple he was counseling, and in so many words, what happened is he's coming home from work and he walks through the door, and as soon as he enters the room, his wife bites his head off. Ah, you didn't do the blah 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 blah. So they go to counseling, and so the guy says to Grayson, the counselor goes, I just walk in the door and she bit off my head for no good reason. And so Grayson says, well, what were you thinking when you were walking up the walk and then entering the house? And he goes, well, I was thinking how she hadn't done this morning, hadn't done that this morning, hadn't done this, so, and then he brought that vibe into the house and she picked up on it. So, right. He didn't physically provoke her like with overtly, but he came in and was like, you're a nothing, you're no good. And she just reacted because they had this connection. So in like a larger scale, like if we're talking about a relationship with God, God, he didn't do this, he didn't do that, come on, God. And God's like, well, you're sending out this vibe that you're such a loser, or you're sending out this vibe that you don't want to work. And he's like, I could see your attitude here. Who are you kidding? What are you blaming me for? So I'm just saying, I'm not saying this about anybody. I'm just saying that if you have this like relationship with God, you can't kid him. So you may be blaming God, and maybe God's like, well, people in glass houses shouldn't throw bricks here. What are you doing? So that's my initial impression of what might be a result of shaking your fist at God. But then again, like in the Torah, we have, Moshe Rabbeinu argues with God, and he's talking about, what would the Egyptians think if you wipe out Klal Yisrael? But he's not doing it in a reprimanding or complaining way. He's like, he's trying to appeal with reason and saying, God, you already sent out the message to the world that you're a king, you know what you're doing here, and that we're the Am Segula, we're the chosen people here, we're your treasure. And like, really? Like, what are they gonna think when you just like wipe us out and start, so he made a rational appeal, and it kind of worked, but that was his approach. Anyway,
Yeah.
So those are two ideas about that. So
thanks. That's a good to digest.
You got it. All right, folks. Good Moed, good Yontif and Shabbos coming up, and we will see you next week. Bye.